revolution as a man of newspapers, committees, and polemic. The pressure on the paper became impossible to survive. Marx was ordered to leave Prussia, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung printed its final issue in May 1849. It appeared in red ink, a detail that has remained attached to its memory because it gave the end a visible political sign. The gesture was symbolic, but the defeat was practical. The presses could not continue. The editor could not stay. The revolutionary wave in Germany had not carried democratic forces into durable power. What had seemed open in 1848 narrowed again into expulsion, prosecutions, military repression, and exile. Defeat clarified Marx in ways success might not have done. A successful democratic revolution could have drawn him into immediate political construction, parliamentary struggle, or a different kind of public career. Failure sent him back toward analysis. He had seen the liberal bourgeoisie hesitate, the workers remain politically underdeveloped, the peasantry act according to local burdens, and the state recover through army, bureaucracy, and law. These observations would shape his later writings on revolution and class power. He did not abandon politics after 1849. He learned to distrust any account of revolution that ignored the social forces beneath political slogans. After leaving Prussia, Marx passed again through Paris. But France was no longer the open refuge it had briefly seemed after February 1848. The political atmosphere had changed, and the authorities were unwilling to allow him the freedom he needed. He was offered permission to live in a provincial location under conditions that would have isolated him from political work. He refused. London then became the destination, not because it promised comfort, but because it was the place where many exiles could remain, where the press had more room, and where the British state, for its own reasons, tolerated foreign radicals more than the continental monarchies did. Jenny and the children again bore the practical meaning of that movement. Exile was not a word written only in police documents. It meant trunks, debts, temporary rooms, uncertain language, lost friends, and the repeated collapse of household plans. Marx had chosen a life in which political principle and intellectual work stood above security, but the cost was shared by those around him. The public history of revolution and reaction entered the Marx family as domestic instability, and that instability would deepen in the years ahead. Cologne had therefore marked both a return and an ending. Marx had returned to the city where censorship first educated him, and he left it with a far darker education in revolutionary defeat. The manifesto had spoken in the strong voice of historical confidence. 1848 and 1849 taught him that history did not move according to confidence alone. Classes hesitated, states adapted, alliances broke, and old powers survived by using time, division, and force. From this defeat, Marx carried away not silence, but a harder problem. London waited with no promise of welcome. It would give him poverty before influence, libraries before income, and a household in which theory had to be written beside illness, unpaid rent, and the small humiliations of dependence. The road out of Cologne led away from the defeated revolution and into the long labor of understanding the society that had outlived it. Chapter 8: Soho, Debt, and the Reading Room. London received Karl Marx in 1849 without ceremony. It was the largest city in Europe, the capital of an empire, a commercial machine of docks, banks, warehouses, newspapers, courts, factories, clubs, and crowded districts where strangers from many countries could disappear into the pressure of ordinary survival. For political exiles, it offered something the continent had denied them: room to remain. The British state watched radicals, and it did not love them, but it did not expel them with the same eagerness that Prussia, France, or Belgium had shown. For Marx, this relative tolerance was not comfort, it was the condition that allowed a difficult life to continue. The Marx family's early London years were lived under the hard arithmetic of poverty. After the defeats of 1848 and 1849, many exiles arrived with hopes, grievances, and little money. and Marx was among the most gifted and least financially secure of them. He moved through temporary lodgings before settling in Soho, especially in the rooms at Dean Street that became almost inseparable from the memory of his London hardship. The household held Jenny Marx, the children, Helene Demuth, visitors, papers, letters, illness, quarrels, and creditors. A room could be both family space and workplace, and the same table might hold manuscripts, unpaid bills, children's things, and letters waiting for postage. Soho itself was not a quiet retreat for study. It was crowded, mixed, poor in many streets, and full of lodging houses, small shops, immigrant families, and people living close to the edge of their means. Marx did not enter London as a gentleman scholar with a private library and an income attached to his name. He entered it as an exile with a mind full of European revolution and pockets that could not support the life his work required. This mattered because poverty did not simply surround his writing, it interrupted it. It decided which coat could be pawned, which doctor might be delayed, which letter could be posted, and whether the day's work would be broken by another demand for money. The pawn shop became one of the small institutions of the Marx household. Clothing, linen, and household goods passed in and out when money failed, and Jenny's letters from these years often carry the strain of managing appearances while reality tightened beneath them. Poverty has a way of consuming attention before it consumes dignity. It makes ordinary acts conditional. A family cannot receive visitors easily when possessions have gone to pledge. Children cannot be cared for without expense. A writer cannot always work when creditors press and illness moves through the rooms. Marx wrote about the structures of modern society, but in Soho he also lived with the daily humiliations of shortage. Engels' support from Manchester became one of the material foundations of Marx's intellectual life. Friedrich Engels worked in the family textile firm of Ehrmann and Engels, a position he often disliked but continued partly because it enabled him to help Marx. Money from Engels arrived in varying amounts, sometimes after anxious requests, sometimes with apologies for delay, and often as the difference between immediate disaster and temporary relief. The arrangement was not incidental. Without Engels, Marx's London work would have been far harder to sustain, and perhaps impossible in the form it took. Friendship, in this case, became an economic institution. The relationship between the two men carried intellectual and practical traffic in both directions. Letters moved between London and Manchester with arguments, jokes, political judgments, family news, requests for money, and comments on books and events. Engels supplied not only funds but also information about industry, commerce, military affairs, and the political atmosphere outside London. Marx supplied theoretical ambition and the central labor of the critique they both believed necessary. Their partnership was uneven in daily burden, but not shallow. It joined affection, discipline, argument, and dependence in a form rare even among famous collaborations. Journalism offered Marx one of his few regular sources of income. In the early 1850s, he began writing for the New York Daily Tribune, one of the most widely read newspapers in the United States. The arrangement connected the exile in London to a transatlantic readership and forced him to comment on a wide range of world affairs. He wrote on British politics, European diplomacy, India, China, Russia, war, trade, and the continuing aftershocks of revolution. Engels sometimes drafted or supplied material, especially on military subjects. The work paid, though unevenly, and payment schedules could become as important to the household as the articles themselves were to public debate. Newspaper writing shaped Marx's mind in a different way from the long economic project. It kept him close to events. Parliamentary debates, diplomatic crises, colonial conflicts, commercial changes, and wars all entered his weekly labor. The Tribune articles were not merely scraps written for survival, though survival mattered. They trained him to think across geography and to connect European politics with global markets and empire. The man who had once learned from Prussian forest law now learned from British foreign policy, Indian revenues, Chinese trade, and the movements of armies and credit. Journalism kept the world arriving at his desk. Still, the deeper work drew him to the British Museum. The reading room became one of the fixed places in his London life. especially after he settled into the long research that would eventually lead toward capital. There, he could consult books, newspapers, parliamentary papers, economic treatises, statistical reports, and the blue books in which British officialdom recorded factory conditions, labor investigations, public health, trade, and administration. These documents may seem dry from a distance, but for Marx they were part of the living archive of capitalism. They gave names, numbers, hours, wages, evidence, and official testimony to the system he wanted to understand. The library was not an escape from poverty in any simple sense. It was refuge and workplace at once. Marx could sit among books and reports while the household struggled, but the distance from Dean Street to the reading room did not erase the life he returned to. He worked with a persistence made harder by illness, headaches, liver troubles, boils, and the anxiety that accompanied debt. The great critique of political economy did not emerge from calm abundance. It accumulated under conditions that repeatedly broke concentration. That fact should not be romanticized, because poverty destroyed more than it inspired. Yet it is part of the record that the work continued under strain. The day around this routine can be reconstructed only carefully, because no honest chronicle should invent an unnamed observer to make hardship more picturesque. Marx's letters, habits, and library use give enough. He would go to the museum to read and take notes, moving through economists, factory reports, and parliamentary returns with an appetite that could become punishing. At home, Jenny might be negotiating household pressures, children might be ill, and letters from creditors or friends might wait with their familiar mixture of urgency and embarrassment. The intellectual labor and the domestic pressure were not two separate stories. They were the same day seen from different sides. The household's suffering included losses that must be handled gently. Several Marx children died young, and those deaths marked the family with grief that letters cannot make abstract. In 1852, little Franziska died. In 1855, Edgar, called Mush, whose loss struck Marx with particular force, also died. The poverty of the household deepened the pain because illness and burial were not only emotional events but financial ones. Marx and Jenny endured what no theory could soften. The chronicle need not dwell on such sorrow to recognize that it entered the rooms where the books were being written. Helene Demuth, known as Lenchen, was another central presence in the household. She had come from Jenny's family service and remained with the Marxes through years of difficulty, managing domestic work under conditions that were often strained and underfunded. Her place in Marx's life is also shadowed by the birth of a child, Frederick Demuth, whose paternity has generally been attributed by many historians to Marx, though the matter was handled within the family with secrecy and later discomfort. Engels accepted public responsibility in a way that protected the household. The episode belongs to the private complications of Marx's life, and it is enough here to note it briefly as part of the human disorder beneath the public work. Marx's exile circle in London was politically active, but often divided. Refugees from the failed revolutions carried old quarrels with them, and exile could sharpen pride as easily as principle. Men who had imagined themselves future ministers, generals, or leaders now lived in cheap rooms, argued in committees, wrote appeals, and disputed the causes of defeat. Marx participated in this world, but he also grew increasingly critical of revolutionary rhetoric detached from real conditions. The defeat of 1848 had made him impatient with dramatic gestures. In London, he moved more deeply toward the long labor of explanation. The British capital itself offered evidence in every direction. It contained the wealth of empire and the poverty of overcrowded districts, the dignity of Parliament and the misery recorded by sanitary reports, the polish of finance and the roughness of casual labor. Ships brought cotton, grain, tea, sugar, and colonial goods into the city's systems of exchange. Railways and telegraphs narrowed distance. Banks and merchants connected London to markets far beyond Britain. Marx did not have to admire the city to understand that it stood near the center of the world capitalism had made. London gave him not only shelter but scale. The New York Tribune work, the British Museum research, and the Soho household formed the three main pressures of the decade. Journalism demanded responsiveness to events. Research demanded patience beyond immediate payment. Family life demanded money, health, and time that Marx often did not have. Engels' remittances tied Manchester industry indirectly to the London critique of industry itself, one of those historical ironies that should be observed without being forced. The very system Marx analyzed helped sustain the man analyzing it, through the wages and profits that passed through Engels' position in the textile firm. Marx's notebooks from these years show the breadth of his reading. He studied classical political economy, especially Adam Smith and David Ricardo, but also lesser economists, currency debates, colonial reports, agrarian questions, technology, history, and statistics. He copied passages, commented on them, argued with them, and returned again and again to problems of value, labor, money, and crisis. The mature work was slow because the problem was large and because Marx kept discovering that one question opened into another. His tendency to expand a project could frustrate publishers and friends, but it also explains the density of what eventually emerged. The private cost remained. Jenny's patience was not an infinite abstraction, and the letters from the household reveal anger, affection, endurance, and exhaustion. Marx could be loving, witty, and tender within the family, and he could also be demanding, absorbed, and impractical. The children grew up around manuscripts, visitors, political talk, and uncertainty. Eleanor, the youngest daughter to survive into adulthood, would later carry Marx's legacy in her own political life. But in these years, she was part of a household where greatness, if it was present, did not pay the rent. The theory being made there had to pass through very ordinary distress. Soho did not defeat Marx, though it damaged the family. London poverty, instead of ending his intellectual life, bound it more tightly to the question he was trying to answer. Why did a society capable of such production also produce insecurity so routinely? Why did labor create wealth that returned to workers as dependents? Why did markets join distant regions while households like his own lived at the mercy of irregular income? These questions were not born only from personal suffering, but personal suffering kept them close. The critique of capitalism was becoming a work of research, yet it never lost contact with the pressure of daily need. The next stage of Marx's London life would draw him back to the failed revolutions and the problem of political power. Before Capital could be completed, he had to understand why 1848 had ended as it did, why France had moved from republic to Bonapartist rule, and why classes did not behave in the simple manner slogans expected of them. The reading room gave him economic evidence, but defeat gave him political evidence, and from that evidence came one of his sharpest studies of the modern state. Chapter 9. Bonaparte, Failure, and the Shape of the State. The failure of 1848 did not leave Karl Marx with only disappointment. It left him with evidence. The revolutions had promised constitutions, republics, national unity, popular sovereignty, worker organization, and democratic renewal. Yet across much of Europe, the old powers either survived or returned in altered form. France, where the upheaval had begun with the fall of Louis Philippe, became the place where this reversal took one of its most revealing shapes. A republic had been declared in February 1848. But within a few years, that republic gave way to the rule of Louis Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon, a man whose name carried more political weight than his person seemed, at first, to justify. Marx studied this turn with unusual attention because it challenged any simple faith in revolutionary sequence. If monarchy fell, a republic did not automatically become social democracy. If workers entered politics, they did not automatically command the state. If universal male suffrage widened the electorate, the result did not automatically favor the most radical forces. France showed that modern politics could move through popular forms and still produce authoritarian power. This was a hard lesson, and Marx did not treat it as an accident. He wanted to know how defeat had been made, who had helped make it, and why the state could appear to rise above society while still serving definite social interests. The French Second Republic began with hope and contradiction joined together. Workers in Paris expected the Republic to answer the social question, not merely replace one ruling group with another. The provisional government created